Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In Pendleton, South Carolina, a 20-year-old woman promised her mother she'd be home by sunset. That sunset came, and nothing else followed. By August 1st, 2024, the summer in Anderson County had already hit its peak. Sweltering humidity, still air, and daylight stretching until just past 8 p.m. That evening, Jessica Barnes sent a short message to her mother. "I'm coming home." The timestamp read 7:14 p.m. Then her phone went silent. Not powered down, silent. She didn't arrive. By August 2nd, her mother, Cecilia Varvara, had sent 11 unanswered texts, left 5 voicemails, and driven by Jessica's residence. Nothing seemed out of place from the outside. The gray pool house she shared with her husband, Brandon Barnes, sat quietly at the rear of a larger residential lot. No broken windows, no car missing. In fact, Jessica's black Mazda 3 was still parked in the gravel drive. Cecilia didn't report her daughter missing right away. Jessica had, on occasion, spent a night off-grid. But something felt different. No return call, no social media activity, no message to her closest friend Bryn, who later told investigators, even when Jess was upset, she'd never go dark like this. It wasn't until August 10th, 9 days after that final text, that Cecilia officially filed a missing persons report with the Anderson County Sheriff's Office. At the time of the report, Brandon Barnes told deputies he hadn't seen Jessica since the first of the month. He described their relationship as complicated and claimed Jessica had walked off before. His tone was flat. He didn't ask if she was okay. Deputies who responded that day noted no signs of forced entry. Jessica's purse was still inside. Her ID and debit card were in the side pocket. Her keys were on the kitchen counter. The phone she used to text her mother was recovered in the bedroom, plugged into a charger, locked. There were no signs of a struggle, but the scene didn't feel right. Detective Morgan Blakely, who would later lead the investigation, recalled in her initial field report, "The air inside was heavy with bleach. The entire unit had been recently scrubbed. The floor was sticky under clean shoes. The house was clean, but too clean. In homicide work, too clean is almost never a coincidence." Jessica Barnes was not a high-risk person. No drugs, no criminal record. She worked part-time in retail and had expressed interest in resuming community college courses in the fall. She had friends, but few came around to the house anymore. Not since the wedding in January. One friend described Brandon as intense and weirdly territorial. Others said Jessica started declining invites, always with vague reasons. Her mother confirmed this. "She just kept saying she was tired, but I could hear it in her voice. Something wasn't right." 3 months prior, Cecilia had noticed a bruise under Jessica's collarbone. Jessica said it was from falling into the cabinet. When Cecilia offered to visit the house, Jessica said no. When she insisted, Jessica told her, "He's not that bad when you're not around." That line stayed with her. During the initial canvass, one neighbor 2 lots over reported hearing what they called a disturbance on the night of August 3rd. "It was sometime between 9 and 10, the witness stated. "Yelling, then silence. I just figured it was a bad fight. Didn't think to call." Another neighbor, directly adjacent, described seeing Brandon outside around midnight. He appeared to be dragging a large plastic storage bin across the backyard toward the side of the house. When asked why that wasn't reported earlier, the neighbor shrugged. "People move weird stuff all the time. Didn't seem like my business." That would later become a recurring theme in this case. People saw things, heard things, but didn't act. By August 12th, a formal search warrant was executed at the pool house. A forensic sweep revealed high concentrations of cleaning agents throughout the living space. Luminol testing showed inconsistent patterns, a heavy presence around the laundry area, faint traces on the mattress, and a small dark smear along the interior baseboard near the bathroom threshold. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to escalate. Jessica's phone data was downloaded. Her last outgoing text was the one to her mother. No activity after that. The last unlocked interaction with the phone happened at 7:18 p.m., 4 minutes after the message. From then on, it remained untouched, locked and plugged in. For detectives, this presented a subtle but critical anomaly. The phone had never left the house. It hadn't been used to place any outgoing calls. If Jessica had walked off, as Brandon claimed, why hadn't she taken it? Also odd, Jessica's car was locked, her driver's license in her purse. There was no evidence of a planned departure, no sign she intended to leave voluntarily, let alone for over a week. By mid-August, Detective Blakely began digging into Brandon Barnes. His employment record was patchy. He'd worked briefly in auto detailing, but left without notice in late June. Public records showed he had a child with a woman named Kendall Mims, listed as his cohabitant as recently as December 2023. That same woman was still receiving child support checks from him. Even more revealing, Brandon had married Jessica Barnes on January 10, 2024. But according to public records, he'd also filed a marriage certificate with Kendall Mims in July 2023, a certificate that was never annulled. At minimum, that pointed to bigamy. But for investigators, it hinted at something more. A man living two lives. And the one who got in the way, Jessica, had now vanished. By the second week of the investigation, a clearer profile of Jessica Barnes had begun to emerge. Not through testimony, but through documentation. Her disappearance was no longer viewed as isolated. It was tied to inconsistencies that only surfaced once detectives examined who Brandon Barnes really was and how many lives he had built simultaneously. Public records obtained on August 15, 2024, showed that Brandon had filed a marriage license with a woman named Kendall Mims in July 2023, just 6 months before legally marrying Jessica. The license was active and had not been annulled or legally dissolved. There was no divorce decree on record, no court filing, no indication that the first marriage had been terminated. In January 2024, Brandon married Jessica Barnes in a civil ceremony in Anderson County. Based on state law, his second marriage would be legally invalid, yet no one in Jessica's circle was aware of any prior wife. The civil documents were clean. Brandon had used the same legal name, the same address, and the same driver's license in both filings. Investigators logged this as potential bigamy, a felony offense under South Carolina law, and a possible motive for concealment. More importantly, it raised a question central to the case. Did Jessica find out? To answer that, detectives returned to Jessica's recovered phone. With a forensic imaging process, digital evidence specialists reconstructed several deleted or archived threads. On July 29, 2024, Jessica had texted a friend, "I saw something. I don't know what to do." 2 hours later, she sent her mother another message. "Please don't freak out. I just need to figure something out first." Neither text explicitly referenced Brandon or the marriage records, but the date coincided with the first online activity investigators uncovered in Brandon's account related to marriage law searches. His browser history from that same week included queries such as, "Is bigamy a felony in SC? How to remove someone from a lease quietly? Can two women claim you as husband?" While many of his searches had been cleared manually, metadata from Google's server backups retained the residual artifacts. Analysts from the cyber unit noted Brandon used incognito mode inconsistently. The searches weren't extensive, but they were clustered around the same 3-day window in late July, just before Jessica went missing. Another point of concern surfaced in Jessica's banking records. She had a personal account, but she was not linked to any household utility bills. The residence she shared with Brandon was leased under his name, alongside a third party, Victoria Tippett. Records showed that Jessica was neither listed as a co-tenant nor given access to shared accounts. She had no claim to the space she lived in, nor financial autonomy over their domestic arrangements. Brandon's financial ties to Kendall Mims had also not ended. Joint account statements obtained by warrants showed that child support payments were actively transferred to Kendall's account as late as August 1, 2024. Jessica was likely unaware. She had never mentioned the child or the account to friends or family. Detectives began to map out Brandon's dual domestic setup: one legal wife, one secretive second marriage, and one shared property with another adult woman who remained living in the same space. The structure was unstable by design. Cecilia Varvara, Jessica's mother, confirmed her daughter had expressed concerns but had not elaborated. "She kept saying she didn't feel like she belonged in that house anymore," Cecilia told investigators. "I thought maybe it was just a rough patch, but she sounded like she was trying to get out of something." quietly. In domestic cases, control isn't always physical. Often it's bureaucratic. Jessica had no lease, no access to bank accounts, no medical proxy, no legal standing. In the paper trail that forms the backbone of any life, she was almost invisible. This, detectives noted, was consistent with coercive dynamics, where the victim is strategically cut out of systems that might offer protection or escape. A review of security footage from a self-storage facility rented by Brandon revealed another anomaly. At 2:34 a.m. on August 2nd, less than 30 hours after Jessica was last seen, Brandon entered the facility with a woman who was not Jessica. The two were seen moving two large containers into the back of a white pickup truck. The footage was grainy. Facial recognition wasn't possible, but the timestamps aligned with a key behavioral marker. Brandon had paid the final storage bill earlier that same day. By August 21st, when officers searched the unit, it had been completely emptied. Only dust patterns remained on the floor where heavy items had once rested. No evidence was left behind, no receipts, no inventory. This development prompted an internal note by lead investigator Detective Blakely. Every detail is just tight enough to look normal, but it's not. It's too clean. The data aligns too easily. Sometimes that's the problem. Kendall Mims was re-interviewed on August 22nd. She initially repeated her earlier statement that she had not seen Brandon in weeks. However, phone records showed 13 calls and 11 texts between them in the 2 weeks leading up to Jessica's disappearance. Location data placed her phone near the Pendleton property at 6:12 p.m. on July 31st. When confronted with that, Kendall admitted she had dropped off items for the child she shared with Brandon, but claimed she did not enter the house or speak to Jessica. Her statement was noted but not verified. By the close of the week, investigators had established a network of ties between Brandon, Kendall, Jessica, and Victoria Tippett. They weren't clear on each person's level of involvement, but structurally, Jessica had been the outlier in every legal and logistical sense. She was married but without legal validity. She lived in a house, but with no lease or ownership. She suspected something, but told no one directly what it was. By August 25th, law enforcement concluded that Jessica had become aware of Brandon's undisclosed life and had likely taken steps to distance herself. What remained unknown was whether she had ever confronted him directly. On August 23, 2024, the Anderson County Sheriff's Office obtained surveillance footage from Midway Self-Storage, a facility located 15 minutes from the Barnes residence. The footage had no audio. What it showed was timestamped 2:34 a.m. on August 2nd, less than 36 hours after Jessica Barnes was last heard from. A white pickup truck entered the compound. Brandon Barnes was driving. A woman stepped out of the passenger seat. She was not Jessica. The woman's build and gait, enhanced through frame-by-frame enhancement, matched the description of Victoria Tippett, the second name listed on the lease for the pool house where Jessica had lived. Victoria had not, until this point, been considered a person of interest. She had not reached out to law enforcement. She had not been seen in the public sphere since Jessica's disappearance. Yet there she was, captured in high resolution, helping load two large black bins into the back of the truck. The bins were approximately 48-gallon industrial containers. Both were carried with effort, indicating weight. One container required both individuals to lift from each end. The movement was slow and deliberate. Neither individual spoke. Neither showed urgency. They left the facility in under 12 minutes. Detectives issued a second warrant, this time for the interior of the pool house, with an expanded forensic scope. Victoria was contacted for an interview. Victoria Tippett, 23, had no prior criminal record. She had been living at the property since March 2024, paying partial rent and assisting with childcare for Brandon and his other partner, Kendall Mims. She had worked part-time as a pharmacy assistant before quitting in June. In her first interview with law enforcement, she admitted to being home the night Jessica disappeared, but denied witnessing any violence or suspicious activity. She stated she had gone to bed early and woke up to find Jessica gone. Her account did not hold. Forensic reprocessing of the pool house laundry area, previously limited to presumptive tests, was now handled using microchemical blood detection, LCMS, and mitochondrial DNA amplification. Analysts recovered trace blood deposits beneath a plastic baseboard behind the washer. The samples were confirmed to be human. A mitochondrial match returned a maternal lineage consistent with Cecilia Varvara, Jessica's mother. That test result allowed investigators to formally reclassify the home as a suspected primary crime scene. Victoria was called in for a second interview on August 25th. Presented with the storage unit footage and the newly discovered forensic evidence, her demeanor changed. She requested counsel. The interview was terminated. At that point, a critical forensic sequence was assembled. Jessica's last confirmed text was at 7:14 p.m. on August 1st. Her phone stopped registering activity at 7:18 p.m. Surveillance footage showed Brandon and Victoria moving containers at 2:34 a.m. on August 2nd. Forensic blood traces matching Jessica's maternal DNA were found beneath a baseboard in the laundry area, not visible during initial search. No outgoing digital footprint or verified sightings of Jessica existed after 7:18 p.m. on August 1st. Parallel to forensic efforts, investigators reviewed cellular location data for both Brandon and Victoria. While Brandon's device had several location blackouts due to signal loss or possible airplane mode toggling, Victoria's phone was more consistent. Her phone was present at the pool house through the evening of August 1st and then recorded travel patterns consistent with the truck's route to Midway storage early the next morning. The route data wasn't enough to charge her, but it was enough to dismantle the lie that she had gone to bed early and knew nothing. Investigators also returned to the cleaned areas of the home. With targeted testing, GSR, gunshot residue, and chemical trace analysis revealed no signs of projectile discharge, supporting the theory of manual force rather than use of a weapon. The absence of blood spatter, when cross-referenced with the blood traces found near the baseboard, suggested post-mortem movement, not trauma at the site. The significance of that? The violence may have occurred elsewhere in the house. What investigators found in the laundry room was residue, evidence of cleaning, not killing. By now, three facts were undisputed. Jessica had not left of her own free will. The pool house had been intentionally sanitized. Two individuals, Brandon and Victoria, had transported heavy containers within a critical time window. Detectives turned their attention to the truck. With a separate warrant, they seized the vehicle from Brandon's workplace parking lot. Inside the truck bedliner, they found remnants of melted plastic. Under UV light, faint red-brown smears were detected near the wheel wells. Swabs were taken. While degraded, the sample returned a partial match to the prior DNA profile recovered from the house. The bins seen in the surveillance footage were never recovered. During the same period, Kendall Mims' role came under re-examination. Although she denied involvement, text messages between her and Victoria increased after August 3rd. 28 texts exchanged in 1 week. None mentioned Jessica. But one, dated August 5th, read, "Don't say anything stupid. We don't know who's watching what." That message was recovered from Victoria's phone. It was deleted but preserved in cloud backup. At this point, law enforcement formally labeled the case as a suspected coordinated concealment involving multiple parties. A neighbor's Ring camera added a final point of interest. At 11:21 p.m. on August 1st, a figure resembling Victoria was seen walking toward the back of the house, carrying what appeared to be cleaning supplies. She was alone. No audio, no timestamp error. Each data point was circumstantial, but the sequence was consistent. There were still no public arrests, no charges, no body, but the net was tightening. Behind the scenes, prosecutors had begun internal reviews for accessory charges, obstruction of justice, and abuse of a corpse, pending confirmation of the remains. On September 19, 2024, deputies from Pickens County responded to a report filed by two hikers at Twin Lakes Park, just northwest of the county line. The call described a large scorched area in the brush approximately 300 yards off the designated trailhead. The hikers initially believed it to be remnants of an illegal burn pit. What they discovered instead was far more disturbing: charred plastic, remnants of what appeared to be metal handles, and an unnatural concentration of bone fragments in a single depression of scorched earth. When crime scene technicians arrived, the perimeter was cordoned off immediately. A standard forensic protocol was followed, beginning with a controlled grid search. Within the first 2 hours, multiple bone fragments were recovered, some calcined, some partially intact. Initial observations indicated the fire had been intentionally constructed with accelerants. No trash, camping gear, or other recreational material was found nearby. This wasn't a campfire, it was a disposal site. Dental examination would later confirm what investigators had begun to suspect. The remains belonged to Jessica Barnes. The identification came through two primary forensic indicators. First, an upper left maxillary molar was recovered in the debris, which contained a composite filling. That filling matched dental records filed by Jessica's orthodontist in Anderson County. Second, a pelvic fragment revealed a healed microfracture consistent with an old cycling injury Jessica had sustained in 2020, something her mother had documented in her insurance claim. By September 23, the remains were positively identified. The site itself told a story. The presence of melted plastic and warped aluminum handles indicated that the containers used for transport, seen in the Midway storage footage, had been brought here and incinerated alongside the remains. Soil analysis confirmed heavy concentrations of gasoline and isopropyl alcohol, suggesting an attempt at thermal acceleration to destroy evidence. But the burn was uneven. Organic remains were only partially reduced. Key structures, mandibular segments, vertebral pieces, and hip bone survived in part due to the poor airflow and variable flame distribution. It wasn't the work of someone trained in forensics or fire science. It was improvised and incomplete. The topography of the site further confirmed that it was not selected at random. The clearing had limited foot traffic and was accessible by vehicle via a side maintenance road blocked by a chain-link gate, cut and bent back roughly a month prior. Tool marks found on the gate match bolt cutters seized from the garage of Brandon Barnes. Forensic pathologists determined the cause of death to be homicidal violence by unspecified means, with significant postmortem thermal alteration. There were no projectile wounds, no sharp force trauma. However, one cervical vertebra, C3, showed a transverse fracture pattern consistent with manual compression. While not conclusive, it aligned with forensic models of ligature or manual strangulation prior to burning. The time of death estimate, based on tissue dehydration and bone charring patterns, was placed between 7:30 p.m. on August 1st and 3:00 a.m. on August 2nd. This window narrowed the timeline of the crime to within 6 hours, one that included Jessica's final text, the last known phone activity, and the storage unit visit. Data aggregation now allowed for full sequence reconstruction. August 1st, 7:14 p.m. Jessica texts her mother, "I'm coming home." August 1st, 7:18 p.m. Last device activity recorded. August 1st, 9:11 p.m. Neighbor's Ring camera shows movement in backyard, direction of outbuilding. August 2nd, 2:34 a.m. Storage unit footage shows Brandon and Victoria transporting containers. August 10, under 3:34 a.m. Surveillance blackout. Truck GPS data shows location ping near Twin Lakes Trail Access Road. Each event was linked by digital or physical data. There were no unaccounted gaps, no unexplained anomalies. During forensic review, investigators also recovered a partially burned hair tie embedded in soil adjacent to the bone scatter. It contained 5 long, light brown strands. Root structure remained intact. DNA matched a known sample from Jessica's childhood brush, collected by her mother. The finding wasn't critical to confirming identity. That had already been done, but it was personal, tangible. And in homicide investigations, especially those involving intimate partners, it's often the personal remnants that serve as final confirmation of what was taken. At this point, investigators issued a supplemental forensic summary to the solicitor's office. 3 conclusions stood out. The remains belonged to Jessica Barnes. The disposal method was intentional and coordinated. The body had been burned post-mortem in an attempt to eliminate evidence. From a procedural standpoint, the case was now officially escalated to homicide with post-mortem tampering, opening the pathway for felony charges beyond accessory or obstruction. Detectives returned to Victoria Tippett with a warrant for digital evidence, including messaging history and geolocation data. Her device had been reset to factory settings on August 5th. However, Google retention logs still recorded background activity linked to her account prior to that reset. One line item noted a saved route to Twin Lakes Park West Loop at 2:17 a.m. on August 2nd. Victoria declined further interviews. In a follow-up search of the shared residence's detached shed, law enforcement located remnants of charred duct tape, a melted strap buckle, and a single latex glove with partial ridge detail on the inside. The print was smudged but usable. It was compared to Brandon's known fingerprint card and returned a match with 7-point congruence, sufficient for submission, but not yet conclusive for standalone conviction. Still, combined with the Burnside analysis and timeline correlation, the forensic weight of the case was now substantial. From a legal perspective, Jessica Barnes's death had been categorized as murder involving deliberate concealment of remains. From an investigative perspective, the emphasis shifted toward final evidence consolidation and prosecutorial prep. From a human perspective, the recovery site at Twin Lakes was the first physical acknowledgement that Jessica would not be coming home. By late September 2024, investigators weren't just building a homicide case. They were dissecting the human dynamics behind it, trying to understand how three adults could coexist in a small home, under one roof, while one of them disappeared, was killed, and ultimately burned in a public park. It wasn't just about who did what. It was about who stayed quiet and why. The forensic trail had grown strong. The physical evidence from Twin Lakes had confirmed the remains were Jessica's. The containers matched what was seen in the storage footage. The partial fingerprint linked to Brandon. The phone metadata tied Victoria to the park. The timeline was tight, but motive and intent remained blurred, particularly regarding Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims. Victoria's silence had been consistent. From the first interview, she admitted to living at the house and being present the night Jessica vanished. She denied witnessing anything unusual, but every physical trace contradicted that. She had traveled with Brandon to the storage facility. Her phone placed her at Twin Lakes hours later. She had reset her device days after the body was burned, and when confronted with the new evidence, she invoked counsel and refused further cooperation. But investigators weren't looking for confessions. They were studying behavioral patterns. The silence itself was the signal. Psychological analysis conducted by a consulting forensic behavioral unit flagged the dynamic inside the home as high control, with Brandon at the center. The dual romantic households, the lease control, the financial dependency, all classic structures of coercive entanglement. What mattered was less about direct violence and more about isolation, power imbalance, and psychological leverage. Kendall Mims, meanwhile, maintained a different position. She was not living in the house at the time of Jessica's disappearance. Her presence on July 31st remained questionable, but not provably criminal. What investigators had instead were text messages suggesting Kendall knew more than she was saying. One in particular, retrieved from Cloud Backup, had read, "It's done. Stay out of it. Don't ask questions." It was sent to Victoria, 5:12 a.m., August 2nd. This kind of language didn't prove participation, but it reflected foreknowledge, or at least awareness of an outcome. Kendall's legal risk lay in obstruction, not murder. But obstruction could still carry weight, especially if prosecutors believed she had actively helped conceal what happened after the fact. Prosecutors reviewed every message, every ping, every digital fingerprint, and by October 2nd, they were ready. A grand jury was convened. Based on the cumulative evidence, 3 individuals were named: Brandon Barnes for murder and abuse of a corpse, Victoria Tippett for accessory after the fact and conspiracy to destroy evidence, Kendall Mims for obstruction of justice and failure to report a known death. There were no dramatic arrests, no SWAT teams, just paperwork, cold process, and sealed indictments. Brandon was already under surveillance. He was picked up outside a service garage where he'd recently taken part-time work. Victoria was taken from her sister's apartment. Kendall turned herself in with an attorney present. Jessica's family was notified the same day. They had waited nearly 2 months for confirmation. Now they had a charge sheet, but no explanation. And in many of these cases, that's the part that never fully arrives. This chapter of the investigation didn't end with a twist. It ended with a structure. The forensic evidence spoke clearly. The digital trails didn't waver. But the people at the center of it still refused to say why. Sometimes silence isn't just complicity. It's control that never stopped, even after death. By early October 2024, the Jessica Barnes case moved from field investigation to courtroom preparation. Prosecutors now faced a different challenge, not collecting evidence, but translating it into admissible fact. What had been built over weeks through forensics, surveillance, and digital tracking needed to withstand scrutiny in a courtroom governed by strict rules of evidence and due process. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for October 10th in Anderson County Circuit Court. Brandon Barnes appeared in a gray jail-issued uniform. Victoria Tippett arrived with a public defender. Kendall Mims was released on bond but ordered to attend in person. The courtroom was closed to press but open to immediate family. Jessica's mother sat in the front row, flanked by two investigators. The first objective was straightforward: establish probable cause. Prosecutors presented key forensic milestones with precision: the dental match on the molar, the mitochondrial DNA from the baseboard trace, the video footage from Midway storage, the GPS trail from the truck, the soil chemistry at Twin Lakes. Each point was independently verified by the state crime lab. Chain of custody logs were submitted without gaps. Digital evidence was next. Investigators from the Cybercrime Division detailed the message recovery process. They outlined the cloud backups, the deletion timestamps, and the location pings that match both Brandon and Victoria to the storage site and burn location. A backup copy of the Google Maps starred location for Twin Lakes Park, retrieved from Victoria's linked Gmail account, was projected for the court. The tone of the hearing was clinical: facts, not narrative; timelines, not theories. Cross-examination by the defense attempted to introduce doubt. Victoria's attorney argued that presence at the scene did not imply knowledge of a crime. Brandon's lawyer emphasized the lack of direct footage showing the actual act of violence. Kendall's counsel focused entirely on her absence from the property during the critical hours. But the prosecution was not aiming to prove guilt at this stage, only that the defendant's behavior and forensic ties met the threshold of probable cause. And they did. Judge Cynthia Holloway ruled in favor of continuing to trial. All three would face formal indictments. Brandon remained in custody without bond. Victoria's bail was revoked after the court deemed her a flight risk. Kendall's release conditions were tightened. Following the hearing, prosecutors initiated a process known as evidentiary isolation, separating the narrative for each defendant to prevent dilution of culpability during trial. Brandon would be tried first, with Victoria and Kendall scheduled sequentially based on the strength and relevance of their charges. Behind the scenes, victim advocacy teams began preparing for the inevitable toll of trial. Jessica's mother had already provided a victim impact statement for the court. But more than testimony, she had questions, ones the system might never answer. Why had no one spoken up? How had a young woman vanished in a house with three other adults, and no one intervened? The courtroom phase wasn't designed to resolve that. It was built to weigh evidence, and by the end of October, the state had plenty of it. Brandon Barnes's murder trial opened on January 26, 2025 in Anderson County Superior Court, just under 6 months after Jessica's body had been found. The courtroom was small, security tight, and the media presence tightly regulated due to the sensitive nature of the evidence. From the outset, the prosecution's strategy was clear: establish motive, opportunity, and concealment using converging layers of digital, forensic, and behavioral data. Each point independently verified and linked by a timeline already deemed legally sound in the pretrial phase. Opening arguments were brief. The state would argue that Brandon killed his wife to prevent the collapse of a double life that included overlapping relationships, financial manipulation, and increasing emotional pressure. The defense would claim there was no definitive proof of who caused Jessica's death and no direct evidence placing Brandon at the moment it occurred. Testimony began with the lead investigator from the Anderson County Sheriff's Office, who walked the jury through the key discovery points: the bleach-cleaned home, the inactive phone, the storage unit footage, and the timeline of movements pulled from GPS and cell tower data. The tone remained clinical, stripped of interpretation. Next came the state forensic pathologist, presenting findings from the recovery at Twin Lakes. The cause of death remained homicidal violence by unspecified means, with a possible strangulation indicated by vertebral damage. The body had been burned with accelerants. The pathologist confirmed the fire occurred post-mortem and was conducted in a way consistent with intentional evidence destruction. One of the most methodical witnesses was the state's digital forensics analyst. Over the course of 2 hours, she laid out Brandon's digital footprint with precision: His Google search history, the deletion pattern, the location data pinging near the Twin Lakes site within hours of Jessica's last known activity. One detail introduced for the first time in open court, a temporary folder recovered from his cloud account titled Clean Move. The file had been created on August 2nd, accessed only once, and included GPS directions from the pool house to the burn site. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the interpretation of the data, noting that Jessica had no known restraining order against Brandon and that there was no footage or eyewitness account of the murder itself. But the prosecution wasn't relying on a single piece of evidence. The entire case was built on convergence. Each digital, physical, and behavioral layer aligned within the same window of time. A turning point came when the prosecution called a forensic behavioral analyst to the stand. Drawing from records, interviews, and third-party statements, he explained Brandon's psychological pattern: control by isolation. Jessica had no access to financial assets. She wasn't on the lease. She had no listed emergency contacts outside of Brandon. Her messages in the final week reflected escalating fear and uncertainty, but not yet panic. The analyst described this as pre-exit panic, common in coercive households. Victims often plan to leave quietly, and when the controlling partner realizes they're losing control, violence escalates. The court heard from one of Jessica's co-workers, who testified that in her final week, Jessica had confided about seeing documents suggesting Brandon had never divorced his previous partner. She hadn't said she was leaving, but she had asked for help printing paperwork, employment forms for a different store location. That request, prosecutors suggested, was the first tangible step toward independence, and the last she'd make. The cross-examination of the co-worker was brief. There was no contradiction to be found. By day 6, the prosecution rested. No plea deal had been offered. The defense, for its part, presented minimal evidence. Brandon did not testify. His attorney reiterated that no one had witnessed the murder, that no murder weapon had been recovered, and that while the state's case was thorough, it remained circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence, when aligned without contradiction, is sufficient under South Carolina law to support a conviction. On February 1, 2025, closing arguments were delivered. The state framed the case as a structured chain of decisions, not a moment of rage, but a sequence of calculated actions. A disappearance that wasn't reported, a body that wasn't just hidden, but destroyed, a life erased in silence. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. The judge sentenced Brandon Barnes to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst, no statement. He was led from the courtroom without speaking a word. For the family, it wasn't closure. It was conclusion, legal, final, and cold. By early March 2025, the Lexington County Courthouse prepared for the secondary wave of prosecutions in the Jessica Barnes homicide case. Brandon Barnes was already facing a potential life sentence, but attention had now shifted to two individuals whose roles, though less overtly violent, were nonetheless central to the concealment and delay of justice: Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims. Their names hadn't been front and center in media coverage early on, but within the investigative records, their fingerprints were unmistakably embedded in every failed opportunity to bring Jessica home alive. Victoria Tippett stood accused of acting as an accessory after the fact. According to digital communication logs, phone tower pings, and social media activity, Victoria maintained direct contact with Brandon both in the hours following Jessica's disappearance and during the 10-day period in which her body remained concealed. Surveillance footage showed her entering and exiting the apartment at times that aligned closely with Brandon's movements. But what solidified the prosecution's case was the physical evidence: traces of cleaning agents, scrubbed surfaces, and missing bedding, combined with the fact that Victoria had been inside the apartment again after Brandon vacated it. The prosecution argued she knew, not speculated, not suspected, knew Jessica had died under suspicious circumstances, knew Brandon had attempted to clean up, knew he left in a hurry, and still, she said nothing. Meanwhile, Kendall Mims' charge of obstruction of justice stemmed from a different set of facts. He hadn't helped move the body or tamper with the scene, but his phone had received a message from Brandon the night of the disappearance. That message, later recovered from cloud backups, had been hastily deleted from the device. It referenced a bad night and warned Kendall not to get involved. Kendall didn't go to police. He didn't follow up. He simply turned away. During the trial, Kendall claimed fear. He said he didn't fully understand what Brandon meant, that he never imagined the situation was life or death. But under cross-examination, his contradictions unraveled. When asked why he had erased the message, he cited panic, yet admitted he never considered telling Jessica's family, even as the search intensified. The prosecution painted this behavior not as passive, but as actively negligent. Ultimately, the court reached a clear conclusion. Victoria Tippett was convicted of being an accessory after the fact to murder. The judge delivered a sentence of 5 years, with eligibility for parole after 3. Kendall Mims was found guilty of obstruction and sentenced to 18 months, half suspended under supervised probation. The public response was swift. Many in the Lexington community felt the sentences were too light, especially given the emotional toll Jessica's family had endured. But the court, constrained by state statutes and sentencing guidelines, issued what it could within the boundaries of the law. The judge noted in closing remarks, "Moral failure is not always criminal, but silence in the face of harm carries a cost. A young woman's life was ended, and those who stood by will carry that stain even beyond these walls." Jessica's mother, Cheryl, declined press interviews, but issued a written statement. It was brief, controlled, and devastating. "I trusted the people around my daughter to care for her. What I learned is that trust can be fatal when silence is treated as safety." It was read aloud in the courtroom. No one responded. Beyond the legal proceedings, the case spurred renewed discussion statewide about the limits of bystander responsibility in domestic cases. Advocacy groups used the story to campaign for stronger legislation, so that individuals who knowingly withhold information about violent crimes face more severe penalties. The South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence published a report citing Jessica's case as a stark example of how intimate partner violence often hides behind the shield of silence, not just from the abuser, but from those standing close by. The digital footprint left behind, deleted texts, Instagram messages, geolocation data, became part of an educational initiative in local high schools, teaching students how technology doesn't just record memories, it reveals complicity. By mid-2025, the Barnes case was officially closed. Brandon remained in custody, awaiting appeal. Victoria began her sentence at the state correctional facility in Columbia. Kendall returned home under probation, largely shunned by the community. And Jessica, buried, mourned, remembered, left behind more than grief. Her story became a warning, a reflection, a reckoning. This case isn't about a single act of violence. It's about everything that happened before and after. About the misread flags, the people who saw too much and said too little, the false friends, the careful erasures, the silent rooms, the blood cleaned from tile floors, and most of all, the fact that harm, once allowed to begin, rarely ends where you think it will. Jessica never made it to 21. Her voice was lost. But in the aftermath, a hard truth rang clear. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and people let it. Looking back on Jessica's story, I'm left with one overwhelming truth. Silence is never neutral. I've learned that ignoring small signs can lead to irreversible consequences, and that speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, might be the one thing that saves a life. No one expects evil to live next door, but when it does, pretending not to see it only feeds it. I hope her case reminds us that our choices ripple, across families, across futures. If this story moved you, let me know where you're watching from or how you would have reacted in Jessica's shoes. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next.